What's up everybody, welcome to my channel, and in today's video we'll see how we take users input in Python. So also in today's video we'll be using Jupyter Notebook instead of idle because I prefer using Jupyter Notebook because it's much more intuitive. Also we have a lot more options here than we have in idle. So without further ado, let's get started. So to take users input, the keyword that we use in Python is simply input, and since it's a function, we're going to open and close the parentheses. So if we just go ahead and run this cell by pressing Shift and Enter, you'll see that there's a box here which is waiting for my input. So let's type something here. Let's say we type in Python. So you see that it simply took that input. What if we want to store this input in a variable? We can also do that by for example saying new variable, and if we do this input, we can type something here. Let's say we write in Python, and now if we want to print new variable, we can see that it has that value stored in it. And by default, this function input, it takes string value as input. So if you want to check that, you can type type, which is a function to check any variable's data type. So if we run this, we see that it says str. Str means string. So, but what if we want to take an integer input or a float input? Float input is something which has decimal points in it. So what if we want to take an integer input? In order to do that, we would have to enclose this input function into int. By doing this, we are typecasting the input that we are taking here, and we are converting that into an integer type. So we can do that by just like this, and we can store this in a variable. Let's say new2, and we store this. So let's say we have an input 23, and we want to see the type of new2. You can simply type this and see that this is an integer now. Also, if you're probably wondering that, oh, what if I enter just a number? So wouldn't it take it as an integer? No, it wouldn't. You can see that here when you do that. For example, let's say s, type in 92. When we check the type of s, we see that it's still a string, meaning that it's still a string variable. So if we want to take an integer in, we would have to typecast it like this. Or if you want to take a float input, you can simply type in float. If you want to take a boolean input, you can say bool, I guess. Yeah, you can type in bool. So now if you take an input as, okay, let's say you type in n is equal to something and you type in true. So now if you print n, you see that it's printing true. If you want to check the type, it says it's a boolean. And boolean variables are those variables which have either true or false as input. So what else we can do is, okay, so we can take string input, integer input, float, boolean input. Okay, what if we type in int and we give it a string input? What if we type blue here and we are storing it in we are trying to store it as an integer? Let's see what happens. So we can see that it's giving us a value error, and that's because blue does not have a base 10, meaning that it says base 10 because by default the base of the numbers is 10 because those are decimal numbers. The base for binary numbers are 2 because there is only 2 symbols. In decimal we have 10 symbols from 0 to 9, so that's why it's called base 10. So we cannot store a string value if we are typecasting it as an integer, which makes sense. We shouldn't be able to do that. So if we type in f, we see that it's an integer. Okay, perfect. So that's what you can do. This is how you do inputs. Also, if you want to, let's say that you want to print the input, so you would, if you watch my previous video, you already learned how to print stuff. So you can take an input. Let's say you type in Python is awesome. It's printing. Python is awesome in the next statement. Also, let's say that you want to print it 2 times. So you can type in, let's say you type something here, T, it's printing pt, you see. And that's because when you multiply any string by an integer number, it simply prints that multiple times. Also, it doesn't necessarily print it out. This is printing because we are calling the print function here. If you want to simply store s times 5 in s, it would work as well. For example, let's say that you say 3, and if you print s, it would print s 5 times. So here we go, you can see that. So, but this is one of the strings functionalities. There's also a concatenation property. I think I talked about that in the previous video. If you want to say tomato, for example, and you want to store that in s, now if you want to print s, you can see that it's 5 times 3 plus a tomato. You can do that with strings. You can simply add and multiply, but for multiplying it must be an integer number. For example, if you want to multiply it by a floating point number, it's not going to work. So we have a type error. It says we cannot multiply a sequence by non-integer because it's a float. So that does not make sense to Python. So it has to be an integer. So we see that it's printing it. So the original value of s was this, and now we are multiplying it by 4. So it's printing the same sequence 4 times. So anyway, this is how you take input. By default, the inputs are string. You can take integer inputs by typecasting them like this. Floating point input, like let me type it out again. So you can do it like this. Float where, okay. So if you're gonna run this and 5.6, so it's a 5.6. You can also check the type if you want. It's a float. Perfect. So today we learned how to take inputs. For a short recap, we see that the input function is used to take user input through the keyboard. You can store the input that you take in a variable using the assignment operator here. You can check the type of any variable using the type keyword. You can also take Boolean input, and what else? You can multiply any string by an integer number to multiply the string those many times, to repeat that sequence that many times. Also, let me tell you how to take input as a list. We'll talk about lists later, but let me just tell you about this functionality. So let's say that our variable is called L, and we want to store, okay, so let's say that I give it a statement. For example, Python is the best programming language ever. Okay, so if you print out L, we see that we have a string here. If we want to convert this into a list, what we can do is we can use the split function, and we can see that now it has broken all those words into different elements of the list. So this is a list. You can see that by typing type, and if you print it out, you can see that it's a list. So, but anyway, I just wanted to tell you about the split functionality, and you can also use it right here. So now if you would, let's say you tell it A, B, C, D, and if you print L again, you can see that A, B, C, D are all different elements of the list. So, but we'll talk about these functions and more functions in the upcoming videos. So this is all about, pretty much all about, taking input. This is a beginner's course, so we wouldn't be going into much detail, but maybe in a different playlist we'll talk about these functions in detail. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.